Going back to like languages and stuff though, like I did have this thought, and don't mean to like sound elitist or gatekeep something else, right?
But I just
talking about
shit out of me, can't.
Do you think you can truly understand a culture if you don't like have at least like a bit of an understanding of the language? Because what made me think this was learning Japanese has really made me appreciate Thai and Thai culture, and made me think about my own language or my second language in a way that I never thought about before, right?
Yeah.
Because to me, learning a language or like learning Thai was just the way I communicated to my mum, and I didn't internalize just how much of my culture was steeped into my language until I started to try learning Japanese, right?
Yeah.
And like we just said, you can translate things, right? You can translate ideas, but one thing that I've found learning Japanese or like now appreciating Thai more is like sometimes you can't. Sometimes it's really hard to translate a certain feeling you get from a phrase.
I think it's impossible to learn a language without learning the culture, and vice versa.
I think you can learn the language without knowing anything about the culture.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't think you can.
I think you can, but I mean, what's the point?
Yeah.
but you can. But like I think, yeah, of course you can, because it's a set of rules and you follow them and you say the words like
right. But just because you know but like
I
would argue
like you can teach a robot a language. It doesn't have to understand the culture behind it. But it knows.
Yeah, but that's a robot.
Right. What I'm saying is that like, well, if that can be done, right, that shows that, I mean, you don't need to understand the culture. Like, you don't have to understand the culture. But I think if you want to, on the other hand, if you want to understand more about the culture, your question was knowing the culture, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think if you want to know more about the culture, the language is probably the best way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I would argue that they go hand in hand, right? Like I feel because the language of a country is a culture.
100%.
So it's like I feel like yes, you could like as you said, you can teach a robot Japanese,
right?
Yeah. And it can speak back in Japanese, but that's because that's a robot, right? It has no understanding of the actual language, and I feel you can only get so far learning a language without knowing the culture.
And on the like counterpoint to that, it's like, well, on the other hand, it's like English is constantly changing, as are most languages, right? Like you go back 80 years and you watch Japanese, you probably don't understand the Japanese that well, right? It's the same thing. Language is a constantly changing thing.
Yeah.
But language is like culture as a whole, but in some ways culture is a reflection of the language that changes over time.
So that's exactly my point, right? Where it's been like such a weird journey for me learning Japanese and just having like I feel like having like a different part of my mind unlocked. It's so weird to try
to used 1% of his brain.
Yeah, it's so weird to try to describe this to someone who has like never tried to learn a language or only knows one language, where you kind of even like think differently with a second language, or like it's
well, people have told me I sound different when I speak Japanese. Like I become a totally different person. But I'm like, I would argue that that's because the Japanese side of me that's speaking Japanese follows more of the Japanese cultural way of life, which is completely different to the Australian way of life.
Like, is there any like Japanese concepts in language that you think are like can't be translated or like are difficult to translate into English?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like,
a lot. I mean,
I mean, I don't think it's just like it's not just like one phrase that can't be translated or whatever. I mean, there's lots of I would argue that there's a lot of English words that can't be translated to Japanese.
Oh, that's
right?
definitely.
But like bussin', for instance, right? Or there's a lot of Japanese words that take an entire sentence to describe in English. Right. But like, there are some like, especially like, I think the whole thing of like just kanji, especially, is so difficult to translate without fully first explaining what the fuck kanji even is, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I always found it interesting that there are so many like Japanese, like, manga, anime and stuff like that so heavily rely on the Japanese language and therefore the Japanese culture that have somehow been translated and have somehow still been understood by people who have no knowledge of the language or the culture. Like, it still baffles my mind how popular the Monogatari series is outside of Japan. Because that show, I've seen the subtitles, a lot of it gets lost in translation so hard. But somehow people still enjoy it.
Maybe the ideas are still there.
Maybe. I don't know. But I feel that like, it's interesting to see like how a Japanese person would react to a show like that versus how a non-Japanese person would react to a show. Both good, both positive outcome, but a completely different level of understanding of what makes it good.
You know, and like the language also tells the history of the country in many ways as
Yeah.
well. You know, we have a lot of French words in English that are taken from, you know, when France had control over England, and Japanese has tons of English words, and you know, it also Japanese have a lot of words that are like very cute sounding to reflect the nature of Japanese society right now. You know, it all kind of reflects it in a way that's really interesting and kind of bizarre, really. It doesn't really make much sense sometimes.
Because I realized when I went back to England and I was speaking Thai again to my mum, that there were just like some Thai concepts and Thai like words that I just didn't know couldn't be translated into English until I thought about it. Like there's this concept of in Thai called jai, which means the heart, right? And a lot of things revolve around this concept of jai. So basically, jai lon means hot heart, so that means you're impatient, right? And that's the literal translation, right? Jai yen means patience, cold heart, right? Now there's this word called nam jai, which means water flowing from the heart. Okay. And you explain that to English, you're like, what the fuck does that mean?
Upset, maybe?
Water flowing from the
heart
heart.
Disease.
and it's
surgery incoming.
Yeah. Water flowing from the heart means it's someone giving genuine acts of kindness with no strings attached. They just want to be welcoming, and they are willing to give just these genuine acts of kindness so that everyone around them has a good time and is more welcomed. And they do that with no strings attached. And there is no English translation for that. Like, because the closest thing you can say is
90 words to explain it.
Yeah, exactly. The closest thing you can say is like kind, but it's not really kind. But like, unless you know Thai, I mean, not unless you know Thai, but like if you've been to Thailand, you can feel this feeling, right? This feeling that exudes from the country, which is why it's a great place to go on holiday, because everyone there is so welcoming. Because a lot of people there have nam chai. And like it's so hard to explain that into a different language, because in Thai that is just a concept that you feel because it's just so steeped in the culture, and you feel it when you go there. But if you don't speak the language, then you don't have a proper word to place on this feeling that you feel people exuding. Same thing with Japan as well. You feel a certain feeling from someone who grew up in Japan may have a different way of thinking and a different way of acting than, say, someone who grew up outside of Japan. And there's so many like nuances with just culture and just psychology that is so like steeped into language that it's you can explain it, but it's from what I've experienced, it's the difference between explaining a joke and understanding a joke, you know. Now that I've been, an avid anime watcher for my entire life, and I've had Japanese concepts explained to me, it's like been so weird actually feeling some of these concepts as opposed to just understanding them. And I guess
like one concept I can think of in Japanese is like this idea of reading the room or reading the atmosphere. It's all kuki or like air in Japanese, but like. And we say like when we read the room, we say kuki o yomu, which means to read the air. Yeah. But like it's not quite the same as when you say reading the app or reading the room in English. Yeah. There's like a whole other like it's like a socio-psychological element to it, that it's like it's so important to read the room, and not reading the room or not reading the air in Japanese culture is so like not good. Like that's like you're basically just societally just it's a societal death basically.
Yeah, because it's like a communication within Japanese society that doesn't require words.
It's
right?
It's a thing that doesn't require words, and it's like this like non-spoken social etiquette of sorts that Japanese people have just hardwired into their brain from a young age, because it's just so integrated into society. And again, that's like another concept where you can explain it in another language. And I'm sure, if you like looked into it and understood it, then, you'd be like, all right, I get what that means. I know how to say it in this context. But, even for me, it's like, I don't think I could fully utilize the word or fully understand what that word means, because I personally didn't grow up as heavily in an environment like that. Like I grew up with it, sure, but I wasn't born and raised in Japan. Right. So it's like, there's that sort of disconnect of, as you said, like understanding it from an explanation and just understanding it through osmosis. Yeah. And like, it's.
And I'm sure there's a lot of things that I've never thought about in English as well that maybe is just like purely unique to our culture and our language, and it's just like I don't know. It's just been really weird. It's made me think about things I've always took for granted in my life, where like language was just me conveying an idea, and I just didn't realize that me speaking English meant that I was learning a part of the history that our country has been through. You know, that's just it runs way deeper than I gave it any credit for.
Man discovers language is history in disguise.
I can see why people get into like linguistics.
No, I didn't get it either at first, and I'm just like,
we're literally just talking about linguistics.
Yeah. I'm just
like for the longest time, I'm like, wait, so what do you study? Linguistics?
Yeah.
What the fuck is that?
I'm like, do you know how to speak? What do you need to know?
Yeah, what do you need to know? You already know the language. What more is there to learn about it? But now I understand. I'm like, it runs so much deeper than just I know a lot of words. You know.
Yeah.
It makes me in some ways because I'm fluent in Welsh, and obviously I lived there all my young adult life, I guess. Oh yeah, no, child life before adult.
Yeah.
And in some ways I'm like, I think I know the culture. Of course I know the culture. And I'm like, wait, what exactly is it again? I'm like sometimes I think, oh man, it's kind of hard to define it. It's kind of hard to explain anything. In some ways I'm just like, it's like the UK but like way more friendly. Like that's just kind of it. Like that's the culture. Like very similar but friendly, I guess, and more focused on being expressive.
It's not until you look at it through like a third person perspective.
Yeah, which is almost why I feel like sometimes, dare I say, it's like it's almost easier to look at a culture in its totality when you're not a part of it.
Yeah.
Because you can kind of like disconnect yourself and your experiences from it.
Yeah.
And sometimes Welsh, I'm like, someone's like, explain Welsh culture to me. I'm like,
Yeah, that's what's so hard. It's like, is it actually part of that country's culture, or is it just your experience of living through that culture?
Right. That's what I don't. And obviously my experience is totally different to someone else, and so their view of my own culture would be totally different.
Would it be easier to describe Welsh culture if the other person spoke Welsh, do you think?
It would probably be a good way to kind of hash things out. Be like, what do you think about this?
This is Welsh culture, right?
I'm like, would you say this is on board? Like it's one of those things where it's like getting a cultural, hearing, if I explain Welsh culture to you, it could be totally different to how someone else might explain it to you.
Yeah. And I feel we've experienced that quite a few times on this podcast where we'd say something all Australians are like this. And then a bunch of Australians are like, no, it's not.
No, it's not.
The only difference is there's not enough Welsh people to fact check me. Call me out. Sorry.
The one Welsh trash taste fan is like,
There is some
and like
people.
every Thai person's just happy to like be recognized. So it's just like, okay.
Like, whatever you say,
they're not going to call me out. They're going to be like,
there's just not there's not enough Welsh people to even, they don't even watch. They're just like, they're not getting recognized. There are some Welsh people, but a lot of them don't speak Welsh when I speak Welsh.
But it's always been fascinating whenever I've like experienced my perspective of like Australian culture or Japanese culture, and there have been people on the other side watching our show being like, no, that's just you. It is and it kind of opens my eye being like, oh, yeah, maybe it is just me. That's so weird.